Good evening, it's Sunday the 5th of July 2020 and this is the Rebel Transmission Weekly Show with me, your host, Ben Somerville. Our main story tonight: shit, 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 fuck, wank, bugger balls. Surely the initial reaction of Labour's Sir Keir Starmer as he's confronted by a previously heavily nationalistic Conservative Party rolling out to the public what they state to be one of the most progressive recovery plans of almost any right-leaning government in Europe post-COVID-19 lockdown. The claims from Prime Minister Boris Johnson that he's introducing the modern equivalent of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal from 1933 must have stuck in the craw of the Labour leader, not to mention being deeply uncomfortable for our Prime Minister, as it effectively brings us to that most curious of political situations, where a right-wing party appears to be enacting deeply socialist left-wing policy, and on a national level. That says nothing of the fact that entering into lockdown and agreeing payment schemes for those furloughed are both, in and of themselves, seen as intrinsically left-wing. Let's face it, many of those on the deep left only believe the coronavirus is a real thing, or at least only as bad as claimed, because it's a right-wing pro-business government deliberately choosing to force the country into economic collapse by enacting lockdown for as long as they have. These people clearly thinking, I despise everything you stand for and I think you're full of shit, but this is so wildly out of character that it must be real. How was this radical new policy move broken to the public by Prime Minister Johnson? Well, using a three-part staccato phrase, as has become the trademark of this government under their haunting background puppet master Dominic Cummings. So far this year, we've had stay home, protect the NHS, save lives, an obvious phrase in and of itself which the whole country could get behind during times of extreme worry. Then we had the slightly less obvious stay alert, control the virus, save lives. This phrase is just about logical enough that it seems sensible, but also just about totally meaningless enough that it led to a fantastic outpouring of memes riffing on its nonsense. Here are just a few of the best. Stay in, go out, do the hokey cokey. Sneak up, shout at the virus, then run. The Texas-themed grab a gun, shoot the virus, yeehaw! And then some of the slightly more close-to-home submissions, such as, we haven't got a fucking clue what we're doing, and be vague, cover our backs, shirk responsibility. The hot new phrase that Dominic Cummings' think tank came up with to try and draw the public away from the core facts of the new subject was, I'm sure we can all agree, a new low. This time, rather than trying to create an overall feel for the policy, we just have one word 3 times, presented almost angrily, one after the other. Build, build, build. Just in case you were unsure what the word build meant, Boris made sure to bring props. Here he is with hard hats in the background. Here he is talking to actual building site workers on an actual building site as part of the actual reveal about actual building. Here he is with the aforementioned hard hat on this time, hailing a cab or celebrating the rise of his Fourth Reich. We aren't entirely sure. And here he is revealing the policy in Manila. No, sorry, that last one's wrong. That's Rodrigo Duterte, President of the Philippines, giving the exact same single-word repetition speech during the State of the Nation address in July of 2017. It led to the phrase Dutertenomics being coined to represent the idea of extreme spending in public infrastructure and facilities in order to bridge a gap in standard of living. Sound familiar? Well, Duterte, it should be noted, describes himself as a left-wing politician, although his right-wing detractors would say that he is a right-wing politician. He has also said that he is specifically not a communist. And it's interesting that he should describe himself that way, as whilst plagiarising his policy, Boris also decided to plagiarise both his political viewpoint and his associated comments. I wonder what other Duterte policies we can expect from the Cummings-Johnson axis. If thousands of suspected drug dealers start turning up dead on the streets without any kind of trial, I think we can probably safely assume it isn't gang warfare. Perhaps Cummings is watching Filipino news with Johnson. Laws that classify our critics as terrorists? Oh, write that down, write that down! Regardless, what exactly was the New Deal, and how is Johnson hoping to emulate it? Well, in the style of something that Wonder Twins Johnson and Cummings can really get behind, it was broken down into a handy three-part phrase. Even more in the style of our less than dynamic duo, they all start with the same letter, in this case R. It's very reminiscent of Sesame Street. Perhaps this time it was for Roosevelt. Relief for the unemployed and poor, recovery of the economy back to normal levels, and reform of the financial system to prevent a repeat recession. No, I think we've probably strayed dangerously into territory that requires full sentences and understanding thereof. The Wonder Twins are confused again. Hang on, if they're the Wonder Twins, does that make Jacob Rees-Mogg Gleek? No, that's not okay. Never mind. Move on. Franklin D. Roosevelt was confronted with the realities of post-depression politics in the US and created a stimulus package that would continue to grow the US economy successfully year on year until the start of the war in 1939, at which point, rather unsurprisingly, the playing field would be ever so slightly altered. It is, to this day, regarded by many as one of the most successful stimulus packages in history, restoring confidence in the banks, returning 1/3 of the 15 million unemployed to work, creating social security, the basic welfare support in the US, and providing vital infrastructure in the United States. And that still forms much of the basis of their road, sanitation, water and electricity network today, some 8 decades later. That said, it failed to get almost 10 million unemployed back into work, it failed to raise the total productivity of the country back to pre-recession levels, at least until the war, and it failed to help many of the farmers affected by the creation of the new infrastructure. In fact, many have argued the viewpoint that the bounce back of the economy would have been achieved in the same sort of timescale without any outside influence. There's always someone arguing the opposite whenever you say anything good about yourself, isn't there? No matter what happens, it's Jesus literally died for your sins. Yeah, but before that, he disrupted bankers and alienated one of his 13 mates, so good thing, bad thing, I guess. Why is this important? Well, let's assume that we look at the best case scenario for any supporters of the New Deal, that it was directly and solely responsible for the successful recovery of the American economy. This gives all of the credit for the US moving past the Depression to Roosevelt and his stimulus package. If you're a New Deal supporter, you want this to be the case because it cost the United States government $41.7 billion. That's not even adjusted for today's rates. That's the actual amount the United States federal government injected into the economy as the initial outlay for their stimulus package. In other terms, it equated to 40% of the GDP of the US before the Great Depression. Think of the person you know who earns the most money out of all of your friends. That's the United States in 1929 versus the rest of the world. Now imagine them spending 40% of everything they earn for a year just on the plumbing and wiring in their house, on top of all their other bills, over 7 years. That's the 1933 New Deal. I would want some pretty fancy lights in my kitchen after spending 40% of my salary on them, and I definitely want those fancy lights if I'd spent what FDR spent when converted into today's money, $783.6 billion US dollars, or most significantly, $6,277 per member of the population. Keep those figures in mind, they're a surprise tool that will help us later. Anyway, we said that was best case scenario for the New Deal supporters. What's the worst case? Well, the worst case is that Franklin D. Roosevelt burnt 40% of the GDP of the wealthiest country in the world, added $11 billion to the debt of the country in a single year, and had absolutely no influence whatsoever over the outcome of the recovery. That would be, at best, a little bit embarrassing. At worst, it would be like spending 25p on a fucking Freddo. I'm still looking at you, Cadbury. I called you on it last week and I'm calling you on it again. They're just not worth 25 pence, all right? Hashtag make Freddos cheap again. Where does this leave us with regards to Boris Johnson's supposed New Deal announced this week? And why did I say at the top of the show that the raving, swear-laden tirade would have only been Sir Keir Starmer's initial reaction rather than the start of a lasting sense of dread as the Tories move to claim the centre ground, or even perhaps the slight left? Well, it'll come as no surprise to anyone at all, especially if they've been paying attention to recent politics, that the speech used as an announcement by Boris Johnson had all of the hallmarks of a piece of Dominic Cummings' spin. And by that, I mean it had the same kind of tentative grasp on reality as Ozzy Osbourne circa 1975 at the height of his drugs binge. Yes, there were some facts there. The government will, of course, be putting into public funds the amount of money that they claimed, or at least we would certainly hope so. It would be daft in the extreme to not do so. The thing that isn't quite so factual is the statement that this is all new money. Back in 2019, as part of his election manifesto used to bury former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn in one of the most crushing electoral defeats of recent times in the UK, Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party started to lay out their spending plan for the next 5 years, and as part of that spending promised £34 billion for the NHS over that period. That is the exact same amount that they have just announced they're making available for the NHS as part of a new deal. That policy is 10 months old. They also announced in August of last year their election pledge to spend £100 billion on public transport and roads alone, to then announce this week that there will only be £100 million made available for 29 road projects in 2020 as part of the initial recovery period, falls just the tiniest bit short of that target. In fact, it's only 1% of the promised funds over that 5-year period. One has to assume that at least £55 billion of that has been put aside as part of the desperate attempt to continue the high-speed 2 rail link debacle, which is basically at this point just in a race with the entropic heat death of the universe to see which is finished first. HS2 is now estimated at £50 billion over budget at £106 billion, so that still leaves £45 billion of the budget for other projects. If we're going to be getting those in £100 million annual chunks, we'll have to have 10 terms of Conservative Party government just to get to the Prime Minister's promised figures on this one single aspect. In fairness, there's probably enough of Boris's discarded offspring around that we could have a Johnson lineage for that entire time and still not have received all of the funding the public has been told to expect. Before we get carried away though, let's not pretend that the Conservatives had previously announced an intention to suddenly become all sloppy with their cash as an election pledge, and that this latest spin on it is a sign of having suddenly become tight-fisted. As part of an initial assessment of these policies across the three parties prior to the last election, the Institute for Fiscal Studies Director, Paul Johnson, no relation, reported that if a single budget had contained all these tax and spending proposals, we would have been calling it modest. As a blueprint for 5 years in government, the lack of significant policy action is remarkable. So the money that we've now been told we should all be excited about receiving early is a small part of the finances that were already promised, which themselves are considered to be fairly underwhelming. It's like hoping you'd be taken out for an incredible birthday meal at a Michelin star restaurant, being told to expect by your friends, at best, a trip to Pizza Hut and be grateful, damn it, to then actually receive a burnt piece of toast. But hey, at least it's 3 days early. You know you've been let down. You know that this isn't good enough. You just don't know who to complain to anymore. It goes further. In his announcement this week, Boris promised £45 million for conservation projects and the planting of 75,000 acres of trees to be planted every year by 2025. From that phrasing, we can assume that that's £45 million total. That's it. After that, the planet is just on its own. Considering Mr Johnson assured us in his speech that this was a Green New Deal designed to help the UK move towards its emissions targets as well as to help economic recovery, but with the environment at the very heart of policy, one has to ask, where exactly is the green in this budget? Perhaps he sketched it out using Crayola Mountain Meadow, because it doesn't come with any further legislation to ensure that business and construction are moved towards more environmentally friendly sources, nor does it come with any of the legislation requiring the inclusion of renewable energy, nor in fact does it make any mention of carbon pricing, and that's one of the United Nations' key strategies to help force change from business and encourage them towards CO2 limiting policies. In fact, beyond planting trees and suggesting that some of the funds allocated to public transport will intrinsically be greener than driving everywhere, it doesn't seem to do much at all. At a recent estimate by the Green Alliance, they suggested that the government needs to spend £14 billion just to meet the upcoming CO2 targets, and that's not taking into account the £9 billion that the Green Alliance also calculates is being spent by the government in the wrong direction in projects that actively harm attempts to meet those targets. That means that our proffered £5 billion of funds, accelerated into the public domain, barely provides us with 1/5 of the money needed to tackle just that one issue. Our Prime Minister is claiming that these funds will deeply overhaul a whole host of inadequacies that the country now faces, yet at the first hurdle it seems not to even meet the basic requirement of just one. Let's go further again. We mentioned before that FDR's New Deal was worth $6,277 in current money per head. At time of recording, that equates to £5,039-ish, give or take a few pence. Even if I'd only spent £5,039 in my kitchen, I'd still be expecting some pretty lights, as we talked about earlier. How much does Boris Johnson's proposed Green New Deal mean in terms of the British taxpayer when allocated in the same way? Well, Sir Keir Starmer answered that question for us almost immediately after the announcement this week when he tried to take the government to task during the first conversation. Barely £100 per person. £100. I don't know about you, but if I'd created something spectacular and then someone came along and created something that was only 2% as good, then tried to directly compare it to my original item, I would be angry. Genuinely, viscerally angry. It's why we are not comparing ourselves to HBO's Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. That is what we're seeing here with the Prime Minister describing his Build Cubed project in terms of Roosevelt's original plan. This is the back alley street market equivalent, the cheap knockoff fallen off the back of a lorry. Actually, that's not fair on cheap knockoffs. I've purchased a $50 Rolex in the past from a market stall, and it was closer to being a real Rolex than Boris Johnson's announcement is to being the New Deal. $783 billion is the cost of the original New Deal when translated into today's money. That makes that £5 billion seem pretty insulting, right? More insulting is the fact that we can't even claim that it stacks up favourably when placed in direct comparison with similar new finance packages from our European neighbours. You know, the ones that we're supposedly breaking away from to strike out on our own as of January next year. The ones that we're supposedly able to directly compete with on a world stage. Germany's Angela Merkel announced this week that the German government would be introducing 130 billion euros of funding for the same kind of public projects to help national recovery and soften the blow of the coming recession. That's 146 billion US dollars. Still only a fifth of the funding FDR put into the US in the 30s, but a significant step up from £5 billion. Plus, from what we can find available in terms of the information regarding that funding, it does actually appear to be genuinely new money and not just recycled election promises with the time frame shifted slightly. It also doesn't include the EU bloc's shared recovery fund that Mrs Merkel, as Chancellor of Germany, whilst it took its position as temporary president country of Europe this week, will have a significant potential hand in shaping. The proposal for that currently stands at €750 billion. That is a significant step towards being a genuine New Deal level of investment available, although it still only equates to an equivalent of $188 US per person in current currency, or a fifth of the FDR New Deal. You know what else is a fifth of something else? The correct price of Freddos versus what Cadbury are trying to charge us now. They were 5 goddamn pence 10 years ago. Come on! So where does this all leave us in the current environment? Well, we've got a right-wing Prime Minister claiming to be enacting a version of a historically left-wing policy, but using the right-wing tactics of moving the goalposts around to baffle those watching, whilst the left-wing opposition tries to hold them to account, all being overshadowed by another right-wing political leader doing a better job of enacting said left-wing policy. Up is surely now down, front is now back, north is now south, and in is now out. Hang on, if in is out, does that mean that we actually voted to remain part of the EU? No, of course not. But at least it looks like we've got someone at the helm with a steady grasp on the rudder. Oh no, wait. That's the opposite again too. Until next week, I'm Ben Somerville. Good night.